And what do you do? Won't you tell us a little bit about yourself and what your current role is, Frank?
Sure. My name is Frank Yiannas. I'm the Vice President of Food Safety and Health for Walmart Incorporated. That includes responsibilities of food safety over the Walmart US business, Sam's Club, and Walmart International. And I probably don't have to share a lot about Walmart with your audience and listeners, but Walmart is considered the world's largest retailer. I share that in humility. We operate in dozens of countries around the world, serving over 260 million customers a week, about 12,000 retail establishments, online platforms, tens of thousands of suppliers, over 2 million employees or associates. And so food safety in an enterprise this large is a daunting challenge, but more importantly, a very important responsibility. And so my role is to oversee food safety efforts for Walmart. But at the end of the day, I often state that my most important role at Walmart is to be the chief ambassador to create a food safety culture. Because when you think of an enterprise this size, you can never have enough people, food safety professionals or inspectors at every point, every day, every time when food safety decisions or behaviors have to take place. And so I like to say my job is try to influence the behaviors of 2.2 million associates as well as tens of thousands of suppliers.
Wow. You have a special interest in food safety culture. What sparked this interest, and how long has this been a passion of yours?
You know, that's a good question, and I'll just be very candid and transparent. What sparked my interest was, after being in the profession for at least 15 years, I came to the realization that the way we were approaching food safety as a profession, as a science, wasn't good enough. So the reality is I got tired of banging my head against the wall, which is we could write pretty good HACCP plans, we could provide food safety training courses, we could test foods, but at the end of the day, it wasn't enough. You know, it wasn't enough in the large organizations that I had worked for. Prior to Walmart, I worked for another large company with hundreds of thousands of employees. And it was this realization that it doesn't matter what you think or know. What really matters is what you do. And as a profession, we weren't approaching it with enough science, meaning that while we relied heavily on food science, that wasn't enough. There's this whole body of knowledge that's called the behavioral sciences. And so I realized that we need to integrate the human element into the food science approach to food safety. And it was just through the hard knocks of, lesson, it was experience. And at the same time, I was fortunate to start overseeing occupational safety and health and guest safety at the Disney company. And those professions were really leaning in and adopting these principles of organizational culture, values and beliefs, how do you influence human behavior, because they were dealing with the same thing. You could design the safest facilities in the world and people could still get hurt. And so I really pulled those lessons from other fields and disciplines into food safety. And I think, some people claim, I don't know if it's right or wrong, that we might have been one of the earliest adopters of incorporating these principles of organizational culture and human behavior into how you approach food safety.
And it's definitely become an international trend. I mean, everything I'm reading, food safety culture is definitely a buzzword. Have you seen this in the last few years, that it's becoming an international conversation?
No, you're absolutely correct. I'm convinced that it's becoming part of the international vocabulary and conversation in food safety, and probably more importantly, I'm convinced that it's now evolving as a subset, a credible subset, scientific subset of the profession of food safety. Things have to evolve, and so if you look at how we do microbiological tests, for example, we no longer do it in glass petri dishes.
Yeah.
If you look at other aspects of food interventions, they're very high-tech interventions to reduce microbial loads. And it's this growing realization worldwide that we have to pause to think about concepts of organizational culture, group dynamics, country culture, human behavior. And so what I've seen over the past, let's say, 5 years is countries very interested in it, ranging from, I'll give you some examples, the Ministry of Primary Industries in New Zealand, regulatory body there, inviting us down to do a seminar for most of their food manufacturers to talk about the importance of food safety culture. There's a regulatory agency in the country of Chile, which is known for exporting very fine products to the rest of the world, HACCP, and they've translated my first book, Food Safety Culture, into Spanish, and they give it away to business establishments for free. The Food Standards Authority in the United Kingdom, early adopters of this concept of food safety culture. And even in the U.S. and China, the US FDA and the Chinese FDA have both met with me regularly to talk about food safety culture. And believe it or not, I've had US FDA officials in our food safety culture training course at Michigan State University. And one of the most gratifying experiences I had was I was invited to train about 200 Chinese FDA inspectors on a host of issues, but emphasizing the importance of food safety culture. So you're absolutely right. I think worldwide there's this growing realization that a food safety culture is almost a prerequisite to food safety. We often talk about food safety prerequisites, but you can have the HACCP plans, you can have recall protocols, you can identify your CCPs, you can do testing of foods, but if you don't have a food safety culture that's built, it's a food safety effort built on, sinking sand. And so, the good news is that a lot of people in a lot of places are starting to understand the importance of it.
How do you define a food safety culture?
It's a great question. I oftentimes, and I actually do this in my course, I ask people to define food safety culture. And why I'm so happy you asked that question is because when I ask people to define it and write it down, I'll get the answers back, I'll read them. And if there's a class of 50 people, in the early days, about 5-6 years ago, I would have 50 different answers. And I would just chuckle to myself because I thought, well, if I ask people to define, let's say, pH or water activity, as food scientists, we probably define it pretty similarly. But this concept of food safety culture, people think it's a little fuzzy or abstract. But today people are starting to understand what are the central features of it. And so I would define it to include very important features. It's what a group of individuals, so notice that I said a group, not a certain person. It's basically individuals in any organization, and the organization can be, a small company, it can be a kitchen staff, it could be a county, a state, a country for that matter. But what a group of individuals think. So what do they think about food safety? Do they think it's important? Is it what they think about before they start doing their work? What are their behaviors related to food safety? So, for example, do they stay home if they're not feeling well? Do they wash their hands before working with food? Do they take food temperatures when they come out of, the oven? And those thoughts and behaviors, if they're part of the organization's culture, then they're sustained over time, meaning that it's not just something they're going to do this year because the company says it's this year's focus or it's the flavor of the month. When it's really part of your DNA or your culture, it gets passed on from generation to generation or from, current staff to next staff. And it's also, if it's part of your culture, I would say the other part of the definition, I would say, and these kind of thoughts and behaviors are learned by being part of this organizational group. In other words, people are influenced by what other people do and say and believe, and so it becomes the social norm in that organization. And so it really has to do with, the beliefs, the thoughts, and the behaviors of an organization. They're sustained over time, and they're learned whenever you become part of that social group. So those are the central features or concepts I'm looking at when I'm looking for a good definition of food safety culture.
And therein must lie some of the challenges or some of the barriers if a company is wanting to change their food safety culture. Those would be the things that they would need to consider.
Yeah, no. So if every company has a food safety culture. It might be one that's terrible, absolutely, horrendous. And some people might say, well, that's no culture at all. It's a very bad culture. and some people could have a very strong culture, but to try to create a great food safety culture, it can be done. That's the good news. But you do have to approach it as science of, leveraging principles of organizational culture and human behavior. So the take-home message says that creating a food safety culture is not a slogan. What I see and hear is people think, well, if I just hire a communication expert and I just start putting out some taglines, we're going to create a food safety culture. While that might be well-intentioned, I can assure you that that's going to fall flat on its face. You really understand it. And I always like to begin with what are the values and beliefs of the organization, because at the end of the day, that's at the heart of culture, which is what does the organization really believe? Do they believe that they have an obligation and duty to respect and keep individuals safe? Do they care about their customers or their society, their citizens' safety? But deeply, a true conviction and belief. And so one of the things I always do when I start at a new organization, I always look at values and beliefs and try to either play off of them because they already say they're committed to respecting the individual or concern over customer safety. And if they don't, then try to, rally the senior leadership team around this concept that this needs to be an element of our DNA of what we believe. There's other things that you have to do as well, as you have to make sure that all your employees have the right knowledge and skills. You need to make sure that the expectations are really, really crystal clear of what they have to do to produce safe food. That means you just don't hire people and throw them into a work environment and hope they learn as they come along, but, train and educate them before. It involves trying to design your work processes in a manner that make them safe, whether that's designing facilities with safety in mind to minimize steps, to how do you formulate products, for example? Could you include an inhibitor to prevent listeria growth? It's not easy, but it can be done. It requires insights, knowledge, and experience.
Frank, we really are hoping that you're going to be able to come and tell South Africans this yourself, but in the last minute that we have of your time, you're aware of the listeriosis crisis that South Africa has faced. What advice would you give South Africa right now about our food safety culture and what we need to do going forward?
Yeah, it's a tragic situation. My heart very sincerely goes out to all individuals and families involved in that very sad situation. Having done this for a long time, about 3 decades now, and having done food safety in many, many countries and continents around the world, I would say use this tragic event as a milestone to get better. It's a tragedy. It should not get forgotten. And everyone in South Africa, whether it's the government, whether it's the academic institutions, whether it's the industry, the NGOs, should all rally together and say, we will work hard to, do our best to never let something like this happen again. What happens, unfortunately, is that when these tragedies happen in countries around the world, generally governments will bring together the smartest men and women to investigate what happened. And whether it's food safety or something else, it can be an oil rig disaster, or in our country, for example, the space shuttle explosion. But at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what the catastrophe is, the significant tragedy. If you look at them and you read them time after time, the underlying root cause is always identified as a culture that allowed that to happen. And so I have to sense that while you may have not seen it in any of the official reports coming from health organizations, from government bodies, or from trade associations, I look at it as from a person that's been doing this for a long time and say, underlying that was culture. And collectively ask yourselves, what about our culture allowed this to happen? And work hard to never let it happen again. And so that means making sure that you realize that South Africa is an organizational unit. Each company has an organizational unit, and you want each company to have a culture, but you want the country to have a culture of food safety. And then look at what are the values and beliefs that have to be solidified, create a social marketing campaign, put the plans in place to make sure that every company realizes that they don't have an accountability. It's not about we're going to go in there and inspect more. You probably are going to do that, and you should. But each company should be responsible for producing safe food. They shouldn't be accountable for it. I mean, the fact that somebody's going to come in and catch you doing something wrong and punish you, you're responsible for producing safe food. Make sure you have the right experts that can tell you what to do. I look back at the listeria outbreak there, and you just ask yourself, it was clear that deli meats or those types of products were a high-risk vehicle of listeria. I mean, it's well documented throughout the literature, and it's happened in other countries around the world. It's a shame that producers in that region of the world didn't learn from the mistakes of others. And so I really hope that this is the beginning of a meaningful movement in South Africa to further strengthen the safeguards so that people in South Africa can have safe and affordable food.
Thank you, Frank. Thank you so much for your time, and we look forward to seeing you again in South Africa this time. Thank you so much. Great. Thank you very much, Frank.
Thank you all. Keep up the good work. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Bye.